customers are not necessarily the people paying for it. Product cycles have to be much, much slower. You cannot launch a buggy product in healthcare. We did about 40 acquisitions. Might have been that we would have saved a couple 100,000 lives. Tech company attitude. Ship it, iterate it, ship it again. Almost none of them have any gray hair. It's the most intellectually interesting, challenging, and frustrating and annoying thing about trying to do business in healthcare.
We are doing our first interview and we're planning to do a series of interviews. Our main goal is to bring some awareness and knowledge to everyone who is somehow connected to digital healthcare. But the main target audience is, of course, startups, because as you know, the stats for startups are not that good nowadays. Lots of them die even before they get their first funding. And I think we could possibly save most of them if we share some knowledge in some mistakes, some common mistakes startup founders forget about usually when they start their business. So I'm really glad we have Jack Henneman as our first guest. He is a great expert in digital healthcare with many, many years of experience. And basically, I'm gonna ask Jack to introduce himself and tell us a bit about your background and how you actually got involved in digital healthcare.
Thank you for having me. I very much appreciate this opportunity, and I hope this is useful to your viewers. As Alex said, my name is Jack Henneman. I live in the United States in Austin, Texas now. And I spent my career in the medical device industry, and then toward the end of it, the biotech industry. So I began life actually my professional life as a corporate lawyer. And then in 1994, I took a job with a startup in the medical device field that was using advanced image processing and neural network analysis to automate and to improve the accuracy of the review of Pap smears, Papa Nicolau smears for cervical cancer. And it's a very challenging manual task. And the technology was very interesting and worked very well. But at the time, the business failed, as so many do, because really it did not fit well into the natural flow of Pap smear specimens from the gynecology office to the clinical lab and back. And that was an important lesson for me, which is in large, complex health systems, technology will not win only because it's great technology. Technology in healthcare needs to work well for many different constituencies. And I'll get back to that briefly. From there, I took a job at a small medical device company in Princeton, New Jersey, called Integra Life Sciences. And Integra in 1998 had $14 million in revenue and $14 million in losses, and about 130 employees. And its principal focus was on engineering smart implants out of collagen, implants that would remodel the body's tissue, such as an artificial skin, a Duramatter closure device. The Duramatter is the layer between your brain and your skull, and so forth. And that company expanded very rapidly, both because of its organic sales and many acquisitions that we did. So during the course of my 16 years at Integra Life Sciences, we did about 40 acquisitions of related companies and technologies, and grew the company from the 14 million in revenue to about an $800 million running rate when I left in the September of 2014. And then I took a job because I had moved to Austin, Texas. I took a job here for a biotech company called New Link Genetics, and I was there for 4 years, and it was developing vaccines for cancer. It had clinical failures, unfortunately, and I retired from there in November of 2018. And since then, I have really done two things. I sit on the boards of directors of a number of healthcare technology companies, two medical device companies. One's called C-Spine Holdings, makes spinal implants, and others called Anika Therapeutics, and it makes actually products similar to Integra's out of a different technology. And then I'm on the board of one hardcore biotech company making drugs for cancer. It's called Aprea Therapeutics. And then finally, I'm on the board of a company called R1 RCM, which is rather large and is focused on revenue cycle management, which is a very important problem in the US healthcare market. And R1 is very involved in digital health. So I have learned a lot about it, about recent developments in digital health, really from my vantage point as a director, having oversight over the company as opposed to an executive in the trenches on a day-to-day basis. So that's my background. The other thing I do is I got involved with a partner in the Austin, Texas-based venture capital firm, Sante Ventures, a fellow named Dennis McWilliams. Sante Ventures invests in startups, and which is rather unusual for VC firms. It provides seed capital in addition to early stage capital. I'm not involved with Sante per se, but Dennis and I have a little consulting practice mentoring first-time CEOs in medical devices and biotech. So we have a lot of experience talking to, young founders. Almost none of them have any gray hair, and so that's what I do. So that's my background.
That's impressive.
Maybe I'll take a breath now and let you, keep going.
Sure. Thank you for very interesting introduction. The first question I have, you probably somehow have connection with other startups, not just from digital health. And are they different, like general startups and startups in digital healthcare specifically? Or basically the main concept, not much of the difference?
Well, I think that there are a great many things that are similar in any startup. So first, any startup, then a lot of things with any technology startup. And then finally, there are a great many still similarities among healthcare startups. So if you are building anything in healthcare, you have to keep in mind, and this gets back to the first point I made in my introduction, that your customers are not necessarily the people paying for it. So let's focus on something such as a spinal implant, okay? An implant for spine surgery. And I'm on the board of a company that has a big business, C-Spine Holdings, in that. The person buying the product is not the person who uses the product. And that's not the person who benefits from the product. And that's not the person who pays for the product. So when I sell a product, when we sell a product, the hospital is the purchaser. And they are technically responsible for paying for it as well, but they don't actually pay for it. The person who uses the product is the spine surgeon. The spine surgeon needs for that product to be useful in or convenient or consistent with his or her own surgical training. No matter how good it might be, the person who benefits from the product is obviously the patient who wants their back pain to go away or their deformity of their spine to go away. And then you have a third party insurance company or the government that pays for it. And medical technology, whether it's an implant, whether it's a digital health solution, whether it's a drug, it really needs to work for all these different constituencies. And then there's a fifth constituency that sits on top of this group, and that's the regulators. So if a digital health solution is actually a medical device, and that's the case often, and it very much depends on the country, but certainly in the United States, which is a very large market in healthcare, any digital health solution that purports to give information that would be acted upon as a diagnostic, for example, is a medical device and needs to be developed and approved for sale as such. So apologies again for the long answer, but I'd say the most critical external consideration that all such companies have to focus on is, how do I make a product that appeals to all the constituencies that need to, want the product in their own capacity? And it's very complex. The most intellectually interesting, challenging, and frustrating and annoying thing about trying to do business in healthcare all at once.
But when you do the product from scratch, the first target audience and what are the priorities? Like which group of people you should focus first when you actually started creating medical device from scratch?
Well, I think it very much depends on the type of product. So for example, with a drug, you absolutely positively need a product that will survive the regulatory pathway, because you really can't do anything with it at all unless it survives the regulatory pathway. With medical devices, that is sometimes a dominant factor, but not always. Different countries have very different requirements for certain kinds of medical devices, and certain kinds of medical devices that are not invasive, they're not implanted. And maybe this goes for many certain digital health solutions that, my Apple Watch is a digital health solution at some level, in that it will alert me to sudden changes in my heart rate, for example, and that kind of thing. And I'm sure it'll get smarter over the years, and I'll need to go spend hundreds of dollars to get a new one in a couple of years just to get the latest features and so forth. But the first, so in devices, there are often markets that you can launch your product into that are not heavily regulated. If you're, for example, based in Europe or based in the United States, and you want to launch a product into markets that are not regulated, they won't have a problem if you do that with a medical device. They often will have a problem if you do that with a drug. And so you need to think very carefully about the specific regulatory pathway of your product, and that'll tell you how quickly you can generate some revenue with it.
So, for example, me as a startup founder, I want to do some kind of medical device and I want to test it somewhere outside of the US with not that difficult regulations and stuff like that. But should I keep in mind some of the FDA rules from the very beginning, or you can adjust later on?
You can. I think the important thing is to understand, because the United States is such a large market, understanding the regulatory requirements in the United States early on, I think is very important, because that will give you a lot of useful information about what you want to do with your product before you are ready to sell it in the United States. And in some cases, even the United States will not regulate it very heavily. If it does not touch the patient, the regulation is much, much reduced. I'm generalizing, than if it's a product that does touch the patient. And so understanding your eventual strategy for the US market is very important.
Okay, that's clear. Let's talk a little bit about C-Spine, where you're part of the board. Like you said, it develops spine implants, orthobiologics, and systems that basically help surgeons work better. So you work with hospitals and surgeons like closely. Could you please tell me what's the negotiation process usually?
Yeah, so it's become very interesting in the and complicated. In the United States, for years and years and years, hospitals would essentially buy the implants that surgeons wanted to use. So if you were a spine surgeon, a neurosurgeon, an orthopedic surgeon, a cardiac surgeon, and you wanted to use the products of a certain company, the hospital would buy them. That allowed for a huge growth in the medical device industry, and not just volume, but price. And that's one of the reasons why in the US, the medical device industry became so large and the market became so attractive. In the last, roughly decade, but probably starting 20 years ago, hospitals began to exert much more control over purchasing, because they realized that these implants were accounting for a very large part of their income. So the cost of the implant was becoming a large percentage of the reimbursement they would get for doing the procedure. And that was cutting deeply into their profitability. So in order to, and I should clarify this point, more than 80% of the hospitals in the country, in the United States, are nonprofit. Around 20% or a bit less are for-profit. But nonprofit hospitals are typically owned by a charity, the Catholic Church or some other charity. And they need to generate income from the procedures they perform to cover their costs. So even though they're technically nonprofit, they need profits on the procedures that they do. So just to clear that up for maybe some of your viewers who won't necessarily understand the American system. Really intensifying about 10 years ago, hospitals began to exert much more influence or internal control over the purchase of medical products. And they really started marching down the line items, right? The chief financial officer of the hospital would, we spend a ton on, replacement knees and replacement hips. So that was the biggest medical device market. And where can we cut some costs? And so they began to put some bureaucratic processes in place. And so now at many, if not most, American hospitals, if you want to sell there, you need to get bureaucratic approval, in effect, to get your product on the list of products that's allowed to be purchased.
And who gives that permission?
Well, it's complicated. Often that permission comes in two forms. There will be a review board. It's called a materials review board that assesses the product technically. Like, is this a product we want used in the hospital? And then there's usually the financial department of the hospital that reports to the chief financial officer. Will say, fine, this product can be used as a technical matter in the hospital, but it's too expensive. And they may name a price they are willing to pay that is lower than the price you're willing to sell it. Now, how do you influence these decisions? Lots of different ways. But in principle, your sales representatives or your distributors try to enlist the support of the surgeons. So if you want to sell your implants in a hospital, but your implants are not approved, you need to get a bunch of the spine surgeons in the hospital to tell everybody that they want these products in. And that will facilitate the economic behavior of the hospital in a way that will generate that interest. Other products that are, perhaps more related to digital health are often create efficiencies for hospitals or other healthcare providers. And if they can be supported by financial justification, you often see that hospital administrations will buy those products and insist on their use because of the financial savings they can generate. So that's a very different kind of sale, and that's not actually a medical device per se, but it is a digital health area. And so I'd say if you can bring efficiency, profitability to a hospital or a physician practice or a dental practice, and you can demonstrate that, you can prove that they will make themselves more efficient, cut their costs, eliminate work. That's great because the amount of regulation is minimal and the opportunity is very big.
I see. Just a small clarification. You said that one of the ways is, for example, to make surgeons talk to the hospital administration that they want to use the device. In terms of product development and kind of user research, and surgeons are users here, do you have like focus groups with surgeons in order to make that product really good for them?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is yes. So the medical device industry around the world, certainly in the United States and Europe, depends on surgeons to assist them in the development of products. And some of this is done informally and some of it's done formally. So formally, the best product development engineers develop relationships with surgeons and will confer with them in a structured way. And so, and surgeons are often very interested in developing or helping to develop products for both reasons of prestige. Sometimes the product will have the surgeon's name attached to it. And sometimes for reasons of financial benefit. You can construct these arrangements. You have to be very careful because of the regulation, but you can construct arrangements to pay surgeons for their legitimate contributions to a patentable invention, for example. So that sort of formal mechanisms, companies sign surgeons to consulting agreements that have to conform with the regulation in each country. And there is a payment plan underneath these arrangements, and they get actively involved in product development under these arrangements. And then the second thing that's done is informally. The medical device industry is a lot more flexible than the pharmaceutical industry in its ability to get a product approved on fairly limited safety data based on its similarity to other products. And then you can do what companies call an alpha launch. You can launch the product with a few surgeons who are very interested in it, maybe because they helped design it. And you can see how it is working in the operating room. Your engineers or your sales reps can be in the operating room, and often are under, again, regulation. They have to typically stand a certain distance from the surgical, the operating table, the sterile zone, and so forth. And this has become more difficult during the pandemic, for sure. But your sales reps and your product development engineers in these alpha launches will see things they need to do to perhaps tweak the product that will not start its regulatory pathway all over again. It will simply be something that has to be addressed in a follow-up filing, again, depending on the market. And so those are two really important ways: primary design and then alpha launch, where surgeons play a critical role in the development of technology that touches the body in particular.
All right.
So,
yeah. Well, thanks for the detailed answer. To wrap up the conversation about the communication with hospitals, for the new startups that are out there, what are the most important things startup founders often forget when talking to hospitals and offering them different optimization solutions?
Well, I think that a lot of startups in the medical device industry or the pharmaceutical industry are coming from people who already have some experience in the field, and they've developed relationships with academic physicians and so forth that may have been the foundation of their idea to start the company in the first place. However, in the digital health area, one of the things I've run into a few times are founders who have an idea outside of, they develop their idea without having a lot of experience in healthcare. And they bring a hard driving tech company attitude toward the development of the product. A super famous example of this is the case of Theranos, which added, at least behavior that was alleged to be unlawful or alleged to be fraudulent. But even without any kind of bad behavior, the important thing to remember in healthcare is that the product cycles have to be much, much slower than in tech. You cannot launch a buggy product in healthcare. You just can't do it because human lives turn on it. So you can't launch, you know, your new, like the first generation of the Uber app didn't work nearly as well as the current generation, and from updating your Uber app that they constantly iterate new updates to improve the product, which is one of the reasons why they've been so successful. That's a tech company attitude. Ship it, iterate it, ship it again. When that attitude comes to healthcare, it needs to be unlearned. And some CEOs and some founders unlearn it better than others, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, this isn't necessarily always good for healthcare. The fact that healthcare is slow and conservative and careful sometimes costs lives. But as we've seen in the whole global debate over the vaccines for COVID-19, an important aspect in healthcare is maintaining the confidence of people in the technology. That's not necessary for Uber. If as an example, if people don't want to use Uber, maybe they'll have confidence in the Lyft app, or maybe they'll just still take a taxi or ride their bike or whatever. They have many alternatives. In healthcare, people need to maintain their confidence. And I'll give you one little example of that. Okay. Moderna had its COVID-19 vaccine candidate with its technology 4 days after the Chinese released the sequence of the virus. 4 days, as I understand it. They had their phase 1 study in hundreds, but not thousands of people done by July, and they didn't have any adverse events. And they knew from lab tests and other things that it was probably going to work. Okay. Now, in the abstract, and I'm not saying we should have done this, but in the abstract, government might have approved the Moderna vaccine back in July. There's a good chance that if it had taken that risk we now know would have panned out successfully. Might have been that we would have saved a couple 100,000 lives. Mm-hmm. But simultaneously with that, had the government done that, the amount of resistance to vaccination would have been much higher because people would have lost confidence in the process. And we already had some of that effect. So these are the kinds of things that affect speed of product iteration in general in healthcare. And confidence in the product and confidence in healthcare in general is such an important value that we do not support, and do not trust product iterations that are too rapid. And that is very much against, I would say, the prevailing philosophy in tech. So when tech comes into digital health, it needs to really think very differently about the nature of product iteration. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think this is a great piece of advice for startup founders, and the great example with Uber. You cannot just come up with POC and start testing your products, because it's really people's life and people's health.
Yep.
And another comment to this is, for startup founders, they have to be ready for really long sales cycle comparing to other industries. Like you said, all the bureaucratic things, working with hospitals and stuff like that. And sometimes I think startup founders underestimate that time that they need. And
time, in the famous American expression, time is money. If you have to keep your company alive, even with very minimal staffing, you and your 3 engineering friends, even if that's it, okay, you all have to eat and pay rent. So if revenue is 3 years away as opposed to 3 months away, you just need more capital to get through that time. And that's on the most minimal possible way of thinking about it.
For sure. Okay, going back to C-Spine, the company recently announced a deal to acquire 7D Surgical. Could you please tell us a little bit more details about the whole process? How much time did it take from the point you started planning the whole acquisition till actually it happened, and any challenges you faced during the negotiation process?
Well, I'm going to talk about acquisitions in general in the medical device and medical technology area, rather than talking about the acquisition of 7D. For starters, it's not closed yet. The acquisition has been announced. There's a contract, but it's subject to various approvals that still have to happen. And so that's the first reason. The second reason is that I'm a director of C-Spine. I was not personally involved in it. And I'm sure I would say something incorrect or inaccurate about the process if I did, and it would not be appropriate. However, during my 16 years at Integra Life Sciences, I led the group that was in charge of acquisitions for Integra. And during that time, we bought, as I said, around 40 companies and product lines. So,
Most were medical devices?
All were medical devices of one sort or another. There's a couple of perspectives on this. I'd say that the art of acquisition in medical device industry demands a great deal of patience. And this is probably yet another difference with tech. So, you read about Silicon Valley deals happening in a very short period of time. The CEOs get together, they have a dinner, and one decides to buy the other company or something. Okay. That is not the way it works in Medtech. There are layers upon layers of due diligence that need to happen. And because the due diligence is so expensive, most companies are reluctant to do their full round of due diligence until they've reached an agreement in principle on the price and on the transaction. Oftentimes the difficult part is that you are negotiating the price with the target or the owner of the target company, and you have very different assumptions about the growth of the business, the potential for the business, and everything else. The entrepreneur who's selling the company, of course, always believes that sales will go like this and profits will go like that, and or at least makes that argument. And as an acquirer, you have to not only be skeptical of those claims, but the reality is the company may not, in fact, perform as well inside your organization as it would have in the hands of the entrepreneur. And that's a fact. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but they mostly involve process. Large medical device companies have to have an internal process for everything because they need to exert managerial control over such things as product development, regulatory approval, manufacturing, relationships with surgeons, and so forth. They have to exert that from the top, okay? Because all of our regulatory regimes hold the senior management accountable for the whole thing. Well, if I'm the senior manager of a one product little company, I can run it very informally. If I am an entrepreneur, I've started my one product, I can move very fast. Once I learn the regulations and everything else, I can go. In a big company, to use an extreme case, a Johnson and Johnson, or just say, Integra Life Sciences, I, as the CEO or the head of regulatory or the general counsel, the CFO, I can't know everything that's going on in the company. I need a process that will ensure it's done correctly and unlawfully. So when a very entrepreneurial company comes into a much bigger company, you have a collision in culture, fast versus process driven. And that collision in culture will have a big effect, especially early on product growth rate, product iteration, and all the rest. And that accounts for a big part in the different perception of the economic value of the company. And that has to be overcome in the negotiation. So it often gets overcome with things like earn-out provisions and other things. And obviously the acquiring company has an advantage too. If I'm a big company, I have a huge sales force. So if I take a small company's product, put it in my big sales force, I can drive a lot of sales with that, even if the other iterations have slowed down because of the process requirement. So all of this will get argued through, and usually you get an agreement in principle on price, and then you start doing extensive due diligence. And that can take a long time. That can take weeks or months because of the level of review you need on different functions. Manufacturing review can take a while, this kind of thing. So it will take a while. And entrepreneurs need to understand when they go to sell their company that it will be the main thing they're spending their time on during that period. And therefore, I would say to entrepreneurs, do not lightly enter into discussions to sell your company. Only enter into it when you are highly confident that you will want to sell and you've got a keen sense for how you want the post-acquisition world to look. And so anyway, I'll take a pause now because I said a lot of stuff and maybe you can poke away at it.
Yeah, but I do have several clarification and comments. The first one for young startups, should they have that exit strategy right away from the first day in order to make the process easier when they actually get to that phase, even if it's going to take years?
Well, I think that so I think it very much depends on how they're funded and what the attitude is of their investors and how quickly they can get to profitability versus growth and other things. So that's a very complicated topic and really depends on the business and what they want to do with it. I do say this, that early mistakes in governance can be very costly. So if you pick the wrong form of organization for your jurisdiction, if you structure it without adequate attention to the legal details, if in the development of your product you think, I'm not going to worry about the regulation now, I'll go pay attention to the regulation when I'm closer to having a product, you may make mistakes that make it extremely difficult to get an acquisition, to sell the company down the road without going back to fix a lot of historical stuff. And that can be expensive and time consuming. And that is such a large topic, and it's very dependent on the country you're talking about. The mistakes you make in the United States are probably different than the mistakes you make in Ukraine. But I would certainly advise that you pay very careful attention to how a company in your industry is organized, the type of structure it uses, why it uses it, get different opinions, and then settle on something conventional that people will find easy to invest in and easy to acquire.
Just a random question. How often have you seen cases when a startup didn't even have a cap table organized properly when they tried to do the exit.
Yeah, that's well, you've centered on one of the really common things, and there are now tools to make this easier, but startups, this was true. This was more true a few years ago. I don't know how true it is today. What I can say is screwing up the cap table is one of those things that can be very tedious, time-consuming, and expensive to clean up down the road. It usually will not prevent an acquisition, but it may make it much more difficult. So, for example, if you don't keep very careful, centralized track of the amount of equity you've sold, the amount of options that you've granted people, the terms, and have it all very careful, the buyer cannot know what a share of stock in your company, for example, is worth. So they may say, all right, I'll give you, and the same is true for the seller. So I'll give you, they might say, I'll give you $10 million for your business. It looks like a great business. Well, what that will be worth to any one of the individual shareholders depends on you having the capitalization table worked out exactly correctly. And it's more difficult than it sounds because some of the options you issue might not be exercisable at a price per share that's implied from the $10 million purchase price. Maybe they are out of the money if you had a down round. You might have convertible securities of some sort. If you issued convertible notes that may convert under different terms into equity under different circumstances. Worse, you may have promised somebody options for doing some work, but maybe you never got around to the paperwork. And now you got a guy out there who has an email from you that says, sure, I'll give you 10,000 options for doing this work, but you never did the paperwork. So it's never reflected in your cap table. And now you have this guy who's like, wait a minute, I need to be paid too. And that can really confuse the situation with the transaction. Today, there are tools for maintaining cap tables. There's a one on the cloud called Carta. I've never used it, but I've seen that it's become quite popular. And I suspect that with some of these cloud-based tools, this problem is diminishing.
Okay. Another thing I wanted to ask, you mentioned that the process of the acquisition a lot depends on the internal culture of the company you're trying to acquire. And I believe, just as an example, 70 Surgical, I think the company is from Canada. Is the international some differences when you try to acquire an international company? Does that matter?
Well, again, I'm not going to talk about the 70 Surgical acquisition per se, but it does matter. When I was at Integra, we bought several companies in Europe, including in the UK, France, and Germany. And there are a lot of substantial cultural differences among those countries, especially versus the United States, but also from each other. In France, in many companies, there's a works council that very much expects to be consulted on important questions, and in any case needs to be notified of important decisions and given an opportunity to respond and so forth. And so when you acquire, if you're an American and you acquire a company in France, for example, you need to be aware of that you cannot run your French division in the same way that you run your American division. And a lot of things will be better. France has some really excellent and efficient employees. And we always found that we had great employees in the companies we bought. But, they had opinions about, how they wanted the company run, and that needed to be taken into account formally, as opposed to the American system, which is informally. Workers, their opinions also get heard in any well-run American company, but there's no formal mechanism. There's no requirement in any company that's not unionized, and very few American companies now are unionized.
In your experience, percentage-wise, how many times when the acquisition process started, how many times did it fail during due diligence or any other reasons?
Well, I suppose it depends how early you define the process as having started. So, if you're a strategic, and Integra became a strategic buyer, a lot of potential acquisitions will come across your desk. Investment bankers or business brokers will call you up. People you will run into at a medical congress will say, hey, would you be interested in buying my company? You will reach out and ask people if they are interested in selling. So a lot of deals will reach the level of, a little bit of thought. And you might even get a private placement. You might even get the selling document and read it and look at the numbers a little bit and have a little internal meeting. If you define the process as starting when the acquirer and the target have basically agreed to do a deal, and they've basically agreed on the economics of the deal. If you then say, well, how many fail in due diligence or in the negotiation of the agreement? Some do, but usually most due diligence issues are not what people call deal stoppers or deal breakers. There's a few. In the acquisition of one company years and years and years ago, they made implants for neurosurgery that went into the brain, hydrocephalus shunts. And we found out that they were using the wrong kind of silicone for their shunt. And they were using a silicone that was subtly different from the correct version to put in the brain. And we decided not to proceed with that acquisition because we could not know whether patients who had that product already implanted were going to have a problem down the road that we would then have to pay for. And that stopped a deal. Another deal I worked on back in the day got delayed for a long time because the company had arrangements with the surgeons that they had involved in product development that were not written correctly from a regulatory compliance point of view. And we said, that's a deal delayer, not a deal killer. We said, you've got to go renegotiate all of these arrangements to meet these requirements. It took them a year to do it. And we might not have been there to buy them a year later. As it happened, we were, but we might not have been. And so this is why getting these things, running a disciplined operation early can prevent a big problem from occurring later on.
Okay. I guess my last question for today is, I'm going to ask you to give some recommendations for young startup founders in digital healthcare. Any specifics or anything general, but something that might help actually survive and get to the point to get investment and to get a really great product?
Well, I think that most of my advice, unfortunately, is probably superficial. I would say the important thing is to find a problem in the healthcare system that needs a major solution. So there are a lot of such problems. They tend to be embedded in the way in which we, different areas in healthcare communicate with each other. And they're going to require complex solutions. I'll give you an example of an area that's happening right now that will, in effect, be a digital health solution that will run into tremendous controversy, that will be a big opportunity. And that is this huge argument that's going on about whether we create some digital marker of immunity to COVID-19, so-called immunity passports. Okay. Now, if you really start thinking about that problem, it's not a simple one, right? There's a difference between people who have been vaccinated and people who have not. The type of vaccination that they have versus another, whether they've had COVID-19 or not. We do not know the durability of the immunity in any case. We don't know the context in which that digital passport will be used. We do not know whether that can be done in a way that does not compromise patient privacy concerns. We don't know, there's just an immense amount of complexity that will go into that. But I suspect that if not with COVID-19, then at some point in the future with another infectious disease and another pandemic, we are going to want an integrated digital solution that tells us, whether it's relatively low risk for a person to engage in an activity or relatively high risk. And I think that somebody who really thinks hard about that problem will solve a big one, but it will not just be technical. It will be a social solution. It will be will need to be a solution that can at least blunt some of the concerns about individual liberty, which are very important in the United States, and I suspect will be in some parts of Europe, and so forth. So that really understanding a big need and figuring out a way to point toward a solution for it is the way to do it. And that requires that, you learn something about the healthcare segment of the economy, which in the United States is 18% of GDP. It's in all its facets, it's huge. So.
But actually, lots of startup founders try to solve multiple problems with their solution. Do you think that's not the best approach? They should just pick one main problem?
Well, I think that in general, in business, defining the problem, defining the potential customers for the problem, and figuring out whether as the solution, whether you can develop a solution to meet that, that boundary setting is one of the huge problems in business, and I think that thinking it through in some way that can make it commercially viable is important. Here's an example. In the United States, the management of the hospital revenue cycle is very complicated. And it really runs the entire range from, the patient gets admitted. So if your viewers do not know, in the United States, we have many different sources of payment for healthcare. And those sources of payment for healthcare include sometimes out of the pockets of the patient, sometimes from a private insurer, sometimes from a government insurer that might be different, sometimes a private insurer that's acting on behalf of a government insurer. So when you say, go to the hospital to have a procedure done at the recommendation of your doctor, planning that entire process in a way that maximizes the revenue the hospital will collect, is it fantastically complicated. And it's an area of huge economic leakage for hospitals and a lot of expense. Solutions that streamline parts of that can be very valuable. Solutions that streamline the whole thing from end to end are even more valuable. The company I'm on the board of, R1, does that. But to do that, the investment required to get to that level, R1 has probably at this point 20,000 employees. To get to that level where you can offer that is a massive investment. So within the hospital patient experience, revenue cycle experience, and everything in between, there are probably lots of little places where better technical solutions can improve the situation. But figuring out exactly which piece of that transaction to focus on, and then who would be a possible buyer of that technology is, that's the whole challenge, and it requires a very detailed level of knowledge.
Thank you, Jack. That was very interesting. Lots of great examples and pieces of advice. And if you guys have any questions or comments, please text them under this video. And I wish you a great day, Jack. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you very much for having me. I hope it's interesting for some of your viewers.
For sure. Thank you.